Um, Ladies and gentlemen, welcome this Friday afternoon to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and a very, very warm welcome to Ed Miliband, Ed, friend and European leader. Tumultuous times in Britain, Europe, and the United States, surely. And it occupies us, it occupies leadership, it occupies thinking. You're really welcome here. You're an MP for Doncaster North. You graduated from Oxford and LSE. You were a visiting scholar at Harvard. You were a minister in Gordon Brown's government, especially on energy and climate change. You fought in the election for leadership in 2010, party leader of the opposition. You won successfully in the European parliamentary election, but not in the parliamentary election that followed. Now you're a backbencher, free to say what you think. You're here to share with us perspectives in these critical times. And please share with us, Ed.
Thank you very much. Well, Mats, thank you very much. And can I say that it's great to be at this prestigious institution, and I'm delighted to have the invitation. It's also, I'm delighted to, Mats, be on the platform with you and to have you chairing this discussion. I'm a great admirer of yours and your work. I think the Institute is very lucky to have you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think these sessions work best when there is a chance for proper interaction, so I won't give a Castro-length speech to reassure you, and Mats will cut me off, hopefully, if I develop that temptation. So, I mean, there's lots, obviously, that we can talk about. And I know there are three discussants who are going to offer some comments. What I thought I would do is, if you like, shed some light on the private conversation that Mats and I have been having for the last 16 months or so since the Brexit referendum happened in June 2016. Because I met Mats at a conference about a month afterwards, a conference in Greece, and ever since then, he's been saying to me, what is Britain doing? Why have you done this? You're supposed to be a pragmatic, sensible, cautious people. We used to admire you. We still admire you. But why are you doing this? And so, in a way, I've tried to explain to Mats why it's been going on. He's visited my constituency. I'm delighted to say to meet some people who'd voted for Brexit to understand what they were thinking, why they'd voted as they had. I think I've had some influence on him. He's had some influence on me. But what I thought I would do is really do three things. One, try and explain why Brexit and Trump happened, because I think they're quite similar in a way. Second, say something about what is the warning for politics around the world, so not just in the UK and the US. And then thirdly, say how should politics and society respond to these forces that we are seeing. Let me start by saying something about my constituency where Mats visited. It's a constituency called Doncaster North, as Mats said. It's a former mining constituency. 30 years ago, if you'd visited there, tens of thousands of people would have been working in the mine. Today, nobody works in a mine, because the last mine closed in 2015. Those mining jobs were very hard. Next weekend, I will be at an event we have every November to commemorate two terrible mining disasters that happened in the midst of my constituency, where in both 1931 and 1978, a number of people were killed almost on the same day. So these were very hard jobs. But that deindustrialization that we've seen is directly relevant to I think, the subject we're talking about, Brexit, and indeed to Trump and some of the forces we're seeing around the world. The irony of this is that there's lots of reason to think that my constituency benefited from our membership of the European Union. Because we were a poor area, we got money from the European Union. Our businesses were able to use the very, very positive thing of the single market to trade with Europe. It's a Labour constituency which really believes in workers' rights. So 4 weeks paid holiday, some of the other rights for part-time workers, agency workers, were very important things that came from Europe. So there's a paradox to be explained. Why did this constituency, which on the objective facts seemed to benefit from its membership of the European Union, vote, and this is the point, by 72% for Brexit, 28% against Brexit? We were one of the top 5 or 6 constituencies in the whole of Britain out of 650 constituencies to vote for Brexit. And when I try and answer this question, I always think of the lady I met the day after the referendum, and I'd called a public meeting about something else. It was not very good timing because people only wanted to talk about Brexit. And most of the people who turned up to this meeting, unlike my constituency, they weren't representative of my constituency, were actually for Remain. And there was one lady, we immediately got into a discussion of Brexit, and there was one lady who said, "Oh, I voted for Brexit," and the people there were not very happy with her because feelings were running high. And I said, "Why did you vote for Brexit?" She said, "Oh, well, I know I'm not supposed to say this, but immigration, people coming here." And I said, "Was that the only reason you voted for Brexit?" And she said, "No." She said, "Really, I voted for it," she said, "because I want a new beginning for my grandchildren. I want a new beginning for my grandchildren," she said. And I always have, whenever I've thought about Brexit since that moment, I've carried around this scene and this image of this woman in the front row against all these Remain people saying, "I wanted a new beginning for my grandchildren. That's why I voted for Brexit." And ever since the referendum, I've heard very similar things from my constituents. "Oh, I voted for it because I wanted a new start. Things can't be any worse than they are now. It's worth trying." All those kind of sentiments. And I think that tells us something very profound about what people were saying in this referendum. Because they were basically saying, we feel ignored. We feel ignored by the economic model of the country. We felt ignored for a long time. We feel like people didn't really care about what we thought, or at least they didn't do enough to reflect what we thought in the kind of policies of the country. We worry about the prospects for our kids. We worry about our wages, and we've seen what were very hard, difficult jobs, but that paid well and had status and dignity, replaced by insecure and uncertain jobs that are low paid. And so that has been a transformation. And the deindustrialization that came with Mrs. Thatcher and the closure of the coal mines has had very disruptive effects on my constituency. Immigration was definitely an issue, as the lady's comment showed, but it was in a particular context. It was in the context of a very deregulated labour market. I know that Stefan Löfven is at the moment debating the issue of the Posted Workers Directive in the context of the European Union. That's about whether foreign workers can be used to try and undercut wages. My constituents, if they were here, would say that was an issue for them. But I think, in a way, the focus on immigration, which was an issue, and the focus on Europe can obscure the deeper sentiment. The deeper sentiment is, we think society isn't working for us. This was like a referendum not just on Europe, but this is a referendum on our society, and we voted that we wanted change. And in a way, the conversation that Mats and I have been having for the last 16 months is when Mats says to me, I'm sorry to sort of kind of reveal these conversations, Mats keeps saying to me, "Oh, this Brexit's a disaster. Why don't you just reverse it?" And I said, "Well, I'm worried about Brexit, but it's much more complicated than that, because what David Cameron did was he turned an issue that about 15% of people thought they really cared about. It was low down, this issue of Europe. He turned it from an issue that 15% of people cared about to one which now a much greater proportion of people care about, because it is symbolic of something bigger. people know in Britain today, are you Remain or were you for Brexit? Were you for Remain or leave? And if you knock on the door in my constituency, people will say not, I'm really worried about Brexit, it's going to be a disaster. Many of them will say, why don't they just get on with it? I voted for Brexit, now I want this democratic mandate to be fulfilled. So that is why it's complicated, and that is why it's deeper than simply discontent with the European Union, or even the problems of the campaign. The Leave campaign told lies about the NHS, yes. People were misled, yes. But it goes a lot deeper than that. And if you then think about President Trump, I think it's the same. And, I wish I could claim great foresight. I'm not good at the predictions business. I thought I would win in 2015. I thought Brexit wouldn't happen in 2016. And I thought Trump would lose in 2016. So don't rely on me for forecasts of what's going to happen. But in retrospect, the same thing played out in the Clinton election as played out in Brexit. People said, it can't possibly happen. Never going to happen, People said, well, it's really good. We've got the whole of the establishment that supports Remain or Clinton. But actually, I think in a way what the Leave campaign did brilliantly in the Brexit referendum was they turned their biggest weakness into their biggest strength. They turned the view of the establishment that Remain was the right choice into saying, exactly, do you really want to trust these people who have let you down? Do you really want to trust their judgment on what's good for you? And it's exactly the same with Clinton's election, with Trump's election. Trump used the fact that there were moderate Republicans supporting Hillary Clinton to say, yeah, the Republican establishment, what have they done for you in the last 40 years? You've got to try something new. And when I think about what I hear from Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, the places that voted for Trump, I think it could have been my constituency and vice versa. So, first point, Brexit and Trump are consequences of a deeply flawed economic model. And I was having a little session with the students earlier on about this, and somebody was asked me a good question, which is, why has this happened in Britain and America? I think it's because, all countries in Europe have some expressions of this, which I'll come on to, but it was related to a particular free market model which had deep inequality, stagnant wages, declining chances for the next generation, and a sense, therefore, that people wanted change and were willing to take a risk. Because I think people knew these things were a risk, but they felt the risk was worth taking and they didn't have very much to lose. Secondly, then, is this just, poor old Britain and America, and, we should sort of thank our lucky stars that we don't have the same problem and it doesn't affect us if we're outside those countries? I would say no, because I think there are wider lessons. We know right-wing populism is not just confined to Britain or the United States. We know it's a factor in Europe, in other countries in Europe as well. What is the warning and what are the lessons therefore? And I should say, look, in Sweden, I know the Social Democrats are ahead in the opinion polls, and I'm not coming here to give them lessons, certainly, about what they should be doing. I think one thing I would say is that you've always recognized in Sweden that capitalism needs a license to operate, and that license to operate needs to be renewed by people feeling that they get something out of the system. And the dangers when you have a lot of people excluded who feel they're not getting anything out of the system is that you have these kind of symptoms, like Brexit and like Trump. But I would go further and say, I think part of the lesson is don't ignore the distant rumble that you hear. Because if you ignore the distant rumble, it will get louder. So if you take the United States, I think in retrospect, the surprise is not that Trump got elected. The surprise is it didn't happen earlier. US wages for the median worker have been stagnant since 1973. That's 40 years, more than 40 years of people not getting a pay rise if they were the average worker. Pat Buchanan ran for the Republican nomination in 1992, so that's 25 years ago, on the same agenda as Trump, really, anti-trade, anti-immigrant, sort of pro-blue collar worker. And okay, he didn't win the nomination, but it should tell you something about the fact that this was coming, and the establishment just thought, well, it can't possibly happen here, and they were wrong. Politics was too slow, too complacent, too confident that it would all be okay. So the lesson is, don't ignore the drumbeat. I think the second lesson is, and we see this a little bit in Britain, don't patronize people by saying they are simply irrational, misguided, or misled. It's too easy to say, and if you think about my constituents, there's nothing that would annoy them more, 72% of them voted for Brexit, than being told, oh, well, you just fell for the lies of the Leave campaign. Well, yeah, maybe they were lied to, and maybe there are people who are annoyed about that, but if they were doing it because of a greater, deeper sentiment, it's not what they want to be told. That it was simply that they were misled. And then the third lesson I would say is, don't only look at the symptoms and ignore the deeper causes of discontent. And that's really about, I think my point is about immigration. One has to understand people's concerns about immigration. One shouldn't sacrifice our own values. I believe diversity is good for your society. I think it's been good for British society. I think we shouldn't compromise on that. But look beneath the superficial, because immigration was important, but as I've said, it goes much deeper than that. If the economic circumstances hadn't been as they were in Britain, would austerity, the financial crisis, would immigration have been as big an issue? I doubt it. Similarly, in the United States. We know that it's in these difficult economic times that fear of others becomes a bigger issue. That then takes me to the third part of my remarks, which is, what should the response be? And this is kind of focused on the UK, but not, maybe it has wider lessons too. I think there are two things that I would say. First, that the status quo is a bad place to be in today's politics. And maybe that's obvious, but I think it's worth pausing on, because I would say that every election today is in some sense a change election. The scale of change that we're seeing in our society, the scale of disruption, discontent, dislocation is such that saying, please be grateful to us, we're doing really well, I don't think works for anybody. In a way, one thing you could say about Hillary Clinton is she didn't do enough to grab change. She let Donald Trump be the candidate of change when it was clear that people in American society enough of them wanted things to change. So I think even if you're the incumbent, you need to show that you understand things need to change and improve, not that you're resting on your laurels. Secondly, and again, I'd say this is maybe a UK perspective, I think, and when I reflect on my own election in 2015, I think this is part of the challenge we didn't meet. I think the challenge for politicians is to get answers equal to the scale of the problems. Think about the scale of the problems that I've laid out. Deep inequality in the UK, the longest period of wage stagnation since the Napoleonic Wars, young people for the first time in generations feeling that they're going to have a worse life than their parents. I often felt as leader, and I often feel now, that the scale of change that we're talking about isn't big enough to meet the challenges that people see. And the one thing you might say about Trump and Brexit, although obviously I'm not a subscriber to their solutions, is the answers looked big. Getting out of Europe, it's a big answer. I mean, I thought it was the wrong answer, but it's a big answer. Building a wall with Mexico could be seen as a big answer. Changing the position on trade, a big answer. So, I think what Trump realized was you need to not just paint in primary colors, but show people that you get the scale of change that there needs to be. So I think the task is to paint realistic solutions, of course, but at the scale required. And in a way, I think that's what's happening in politics. So, and this is probably not something on the agenda in Sweden, because you have a widely admired universal welfare state. But you're seeing in Britain and the United States a resurgence of interest in the idea of a universal basic income. So this is the idea of a flat rate payment to people, irrespective of their conditions, as a foundation, as a floor, if you like, for them to work or do whatever they want to do. Why is that becoming, I hesitate to say fashionable, but why is that becoming something that people are talking about? Because it speaks to the challenges of inequality. It speaks to the worries about mechanization and automation. And it speaks to the idea of a different social contract, a need to renew and change the social contract. In the US, they're talking about a national health insurance system, a single-payer healthcare system, in a way that hasn't been talked about for generations, again, because I think it gets at the scale of change. And I think there are lots of other areas where we need to show some similar radicalism. I'll just mention a few areas. How do you regulate the large tech monopolies? I think this is going to be a massive issue for societies going forward. How do you rebalance risk in the modern economy? In Britain, at least, you've seen risk all being loaded onto the employee and no longer a fair sharing of risk between government, employer, and employee. How do you change the tax system to tackle the income and wealth inequality that we see? How do you put the climate crisis at the center of everything we do? So these are big questions, and I guess my point is that there's an attitude of mind and radicalism which I think is required, and I think is at least in the UK and US will be a prerequisite of modern politics, at least for some time to come, because of the scale of change that people are wanting to see. That's my argument. Let me just end on this note, which is, again, goes back to a question I was asked earlier, which is, should one feel pessimistic? Sounds pretty pessimistic, a lot of this. Funnily enough, I'm not pessimistic, because obviously I'm worried about Brexit, and I'm obviously worried about Trump as well. But I think what's interesting is that out of this moment of uncertainty comes huge opportunity. If you think about the history of Sweden, it was out of the crisis of World War I that the social democratic settlement eventually arose. If you think about Britain, it was out of the Second World War that the welfare state arose. If you think about America, the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, came out of the Great Depression. So I think that this crisis does offer an opportunity once again. And the last point I'll make is this, which is, I think the younger generation, I'm not just saying this because there are young people in this audience, I think the younger generation should inspire us in this. There's this term that has been invented in Britain called centrist dad. What is a centrist dad? A centrist dad is somebody who says to the younger generation that says, I'm idealistic, I want to see big change, I'm inspired by Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, you don't really understand. This has been tried before, it was not going to work. And I don't think we should be centrist dads or mums about this. I think it's really important to say to young people who are deeply discontented by the world, by the climate crisis, by inequality, by all of these things, that they're not wrong, but they're right. And that the world can be changed and societies can be changed. And to see them as allies in this process. So in a way, I think the test for politics in the years ahead is, can we match these scale of these problems that I've identified with the scale of solutions that are required? And I think that is a really important, worthwhile endeavor, and that's the endeavor that I want to be part of in the UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed, for sharing reflections on why this is happening and also what is to be done. I recall the day I spent in Doncaster, slightly impressed, not just by the fact that some were saying, let's get on with it, we made the decision, or slightly discouraged by a number of people I met who, in middle-aged, had never voted. But what I felt in discussing the issue with a number of people was a reflective mood. And it's this reflective mood that you are trying to make sure is something of an opportunity when otherwise the objective outcomes of Brexit are so challenging. Anyway, it's a challenge. You wanted to hear what some of the young people are saying, and we have three fantastically young and experienced, well, even you, even my dear Björn, with your beginning streaks of grey. Please join us here at the podium for a few commentaries. So we have Noura Berrouba, who is the Swedish youth representative to the UN 2016 governing body member of the European Youth Parliament, and you're a student at Uppsala University. Then we have Natalia Grbic, who is president of the Stockholm Association of International Affairs, Utrikespolitiska föreningarna. Det är med dem som vi tidigare har organiserat ett möte här. It's with them that we earlier organized a meeting with Ed here for him to have an opportunity to listen to students. And of course, Björn Fägersten, very well known director of the Europe program here at the Institute. So Noura, would you like to give us your comments first?
Can you hear me? Perfect. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the really great speech. I think you covered a lot of aspects that are not only specific to the UK, the US, and the world, but also to Sweden, and some learning points that we can also get from Brexit and how the UK is dealing with it. Like, move the mic. Oh, move it. New technology, great. But something that I've been hearing a lot of times throughout the year is one quote, which is, it's the third time the Brits and the US save Europe. And I think this is kind of true, because Europe after Brexit has gotten closer. We did have a trend of, populistic parties. We still have this trend. But I think it kind of shifted in many countries, the outcome of many elections. Another thing that I think was really interesting in your remarks when you spoke to us earlier about young people and referred to us as radical, I think we need to reclaim the word radical. It's very often used in a negative sense, but what it kind of means is that you want change, you want progress, you have an idealistic mindset, but you want pragmatism and change to happen. And one thing in particular in the end of your speech, when you said we should not be pessimistic, we should be worried, we should not be pessimistic, and there is huge opportunity after Brexit. And I do think that one thing in particular will be more important than anything else. The UK after Brexit won't have a European Union to blame. It won't have immigrants to blame. So it will really have to look inwards at changing the British system, the economic inequalities that you talk about, unemployment, the housing issues. These are things that the UK will need to deal with on its own. So there will be no one to blame. But I think that also puts bigger accountability on government in the UK. In recent weeks, Jeremy Corbyn made a statement about voting age, where he suggested that a voting age of 16 would be a good idea. And I think this is also the outcome of the election earlier this spring, where a lot of young people voted for the Labour Party and mobilized for the Labour Party. Do you have an idea about vote at 16 and whether you think this is a good idea? And the second question is, what specific areas do you want the UK to look inwards at more? Another question for you to consider would be, what relationships will the UK have post-Brexit with the rest of the world and with Europe? Are you looking at more bilateral partnerships? What would be the ideal scenario for the Brexit negotiations? And you also covered workers' rights, and these 2 days we have a social summit in Gothenburg. So would be very interesting to hear your perspectives, even as a country that is exiting the EU on a potential social pillar.
I don't know, Ed, with so many questions, whether you want to pick up. Okay, I keep that original plan. Natalia.
Thank you. I want to begin by saying that I share your view of that we need to be optimistic, and that I'm as well. I'm not pessimistic about, especially the future young generation that we're a part of. I want to comment some on the view of fake news and social media. A lot of people say that one of the reasons that Trump won, or the populism in the UK and the Brexit, are part of the so-called fake news, and the fake news they're spreading across social media as well. And I actually read up on some statistics that more than 60% of adults in the US get their news from social media. And as I'm a young person, I use social media every day. It's a very integral part of our lives as youths, especially here in Europe and the Western world. I actually see social media as an advantage, because as I've worked here in our student association, we can reach a lot of more people now than we could before because of social media. So I want to know, how can we face these challenges of fake news, and how we can actually use social media as a strong point rather than something that's negative and that spreads populism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming and giving this speech. I must say that the most depressing thing I saw from this meeting in Gothenburg was the European Commission's suggestion to create a new European education area for 2025, and it was a map on the front page of Europe without the UK. And it's depressing, because I can think of no other area where the links are so many and so strong as in the educational and research business. I spent a year in Aberystwyth, a place I wouldn't have found, I think, if not with help from the European Union. So just to start with that. And that leads me to a question of also of self-criticism. Because if I understand this correct, your countryman David Davis this week went to Germany and warned them in Berlin, the Germans, that I quote, putting politics above prosperity is never a smart choice. Pretty rich.
He's going into the comedy business, I think, actually.
Yes. I'm going to be kind, and I think that, well, this is probably a very humbling thing for him to say, because he's the very person that is managing this process of putting politics above prosperity. So I read this as an act of self-criticism. But I wonder then if Labour is up to any self-criticism, because of course the Tories have been criticized for actually their EU bashing for decades, and then trying to turn the audience in a couple of months. But from a Labour perspective, do you have any kind of self-criticism of how you have been selling the European project, European integration, to your voters and communicated European integration for the last decade? So that would be one question. The second was something you talked about with Trump, and how we should not look only at the symptoms. Because, I mean, obviously Trump is, I guess, highly problematic also for Brexit. It would have been easier under Clinton, because she would have upheld the kind of order that you would have benefited from as a global UK or global Britain. But with Trump, you get something else, and all these systems that you are relying on, as we are shaking right now, because he simply doesn't believe in what we call the liberal world order, contracts, the multilateralism, international institutions, etc. But if Trump is actually not the cause of this, but rather the symptom, if there is an underlying structural change in American society, and you will see less of this liberal order or support for this liberal order from the US, what does that tell us about the future of your special relationship? How will the UK be affected by a new American turn when it comes to almost illiberalism? What does it mean for you and your special relationship? Thank you.
Go.
respond to some of those? Very good comments, thank you. So going in order, I am actually a supporter of votes at 16 and have been for a long time. I mean, it wouldn't have changed the referendum result, but there's a great irony that in the Scottish referendum, which David Cameron, his side won, 16 and 17-year-olds were allowed to vote, but in the European referendum, which he lost, 16 and 17-year-olds weren't allowed to vote. He feared, I'm afraid, doesn't speak very well for him, but he feared that 16 and 17-year-olds voting they would vote at a general election and they would be bad. It would be bad for him, I think. What should we be focusing when we look inwards? I liked your point very much about we won't have Europe or immigration to blame. I think it's a very good point. But one thing which I haven't mentioned, which we should focus on, is the extraordinary geographical inequality that there is in the UK. I mean, we talk about inequality, we talk about wealth and income inequality. The figures are extraordinary. If you look at the way the southeast of England is so above the European average, and I think every other region is below the European average when it comes to prosperity. That tells you about the divide that there is. And if you're looking for something to read which paints a very, very good picture of some of the challenges in English towns, I represent the town Doncaster, but this is about Blackpool. It was an absolutely brilliant piece in the Financial Times yesterday by a woman called Sarah O'Connor, who's our employment correspondent, looking at Blackpool, which is a seaside town in England, and some of the social, economic, and other pathologies, problems that it faces. So, I mean, tackling inequality, but I particularly point to these geographical divides that there are. What relations with Europe and the rest of the world is obviously a very big, but very important question. I want the closest possible, I should have said this, I want the closest possible relationship we can have. We're going to be outside the European Union, but I want to be as close as we can be strategically, economically, because I think it's better for Britain and better for Europe. And, I think that what actually the best we can hope for in this is that over time, we end up with 3 different circles around Europe. The inner circle, which is in the euro, the outer circle, or the second circle, that is in the European Union, but outside the euro, and then a third circle of cooperation. And actually, I think in any sensible, rational world, given that we've got to cooperate for our own self-interests, or mutual self-interest, on climate change and trade and foreign policy and the refugee crisis and all of that, that is obviously the right way to go. I'm in favour of the social pillar that the Swedish government is talking about. On this point about fake news and social media, I think it's really powerful and important. I think to give credit to Jeremy Corbyn and his 2017 campaign, we have our own version of fake news, which is the British tabloids, which I'll come on to in a moment, and because they are relevant to the European issue. But one thing he managed to do was turn social media to his advantage. So there's an organization called Momentum, which has had a lot of criticism in the Labour Party because some people see it as a party within a party. But actually what they did in the election campaign was they found ways to produce videos and content which got to a lot of people through Facebook and other means. Much, much better than anything the Conservatives did. And it was a way to counter some of the fake news coming from the tabloids. The Daily Mail published a thing 2 days before the election, 15 pages on why Jeremy Corbyn's a terrorist or, likes terrorists. The Sun newspaper was the same. Now, it had some effect. I think it would be wrong to say it didn't have an effect, but there were ways to also counter that effect through social media. One of the things that some of the centrist dads said during the election campaign was when Jeremy Corbyn had lots of people coming to his meetings, they said, well, this happened in 1983 when Michael Foot went down to the worst defeat the Labour Party had had since its foundation, practically. He had lots of people at his meetings. What the centrist dads didn't realise was that the young people who were there were also on Facebook communicating with their friends about the rally. So he did this rally in, I think it may have been Blackpool actually, or somewhere in that region, and 1.5 million people in the UK watched it on Facebook. Watched it live. So this social media is incredibly powerful, but obviously also has its dangers, and we've got to counter those dangers. On the questions about the US and the Labour's self-criticism, the answer on self-criticism is absolutely yes. The context was tabloid hostility to the European Union, but it's absolutely clear in retrospect that we didn't do nearly enough to, it's sort of the other side were engaged in a 20-year campaign to undermine the Euro, or 30-year campaign to undermine the European Union, everything from sort of bendy bananas to immigration. And the people who wanted us to stay in were far too complacent and also far too willing to go along with some of the Brussels bashing that there was. I mean, I completely accept that point. I suspect actually most Labour politicians when we were in government, 1997 to 2010, would accept that as well. I mean, additionally, because nobody has said this, the European institutions are not faultless in relation to these questions in a whole number of respects. I'm not saying that this was the thing that was determining the referendum, but when you looked at some of the treatment of Greece during the Euro crisis, I think it was deeply worrying about what it said about the European institutions and how they worked and the regard for democracy. And so I don't think the European institutions are exempt, but Labour certainly isn't exempt either. On your point about Trump and the direction in which he's going, I've said right all the way along, ever since he was elected, that I thought Theresa May's strategy, which was apparently to kind of hitch her wagon to Trump, was an extremely dangerous strategy. I mean, the notion that a free trade agreement will sort of with the US will bail us out, I mean, is nonsense in a whole number of respects. First of all, because Europe is our biggest market by a long, long way. Secondly, frankly, Donald Trump selling us chlorinated chicken is not particularly what we should be kind of championing. And thirdly, you're hitching your fate to a guy who will say one thing 1 minute and another thing the next minute. And fourthly, the prospects of a sort of great trade agreement. This guy's anti-trade. That's the whole point about him. So the notion that you're going to get a great trade agreement from him is very dubious. I think we have to stand up for those values of multilateralism and cooperation, from everything from climate change to all the foreign policy questions. And in a way, you've got to sort of slightly stand up to Trump and what he's doing, which I think Chancellor Merkel has actually done very well. And then you've got to sort of slightly wait it out and hope that eventually, they get rid of him. You can't hitch your wagon to him, basically.
Thanks very much, Ed. Noura, did you get answers? Oh, good. Natalia?
To those questions, at least.
All right. Björn, you want to
just
follow up?
Just a short follow-up question, since you ended up with something about Angela Merkel. And just a question, you talked very interesting about change and the scale of change, but Angela Merkel is a person who's campaigned on status quo, essentially, or, non-change, stability. And what's the difference here between Germany and other countries then?
Well, I think it's partly economic success, but also she didn't do as well as the election as people thought on the basis of the status quo. I mean, I think it's always the case that incumbency has its limitations, but I think it's particularly the case in the current environment.
Well, shall we turn to the audience and get some commentary from here as well? Okay, you already signaled quite a while ago, so please. Yeah?
Yes, Ellis Wallner, thank you. You mentioned in your opening remarks about an economic crisis, but you didn't mention a political or a democratic crisis. I come originally from the United States. It's 45 years ago, but I know their politics and system much better than the British. I would suggest in the United States there's even a democratic crisis. The whole political system is so corrupt. The money, the restriction on people voting, and so on. And it's a question of the damage that he's doing now to institutions and so on, if it's irreparable. There was an interview I saw on YouTube this morning with Joseph Stiglitz, which talks about his fascist tendencies. My question is, you see also a democratic and political crisis.
Pass it to your right, please. We'll take 3 questions, I think.
My name is Bengt Säve-Söderberg. I have 2 questions. I'm trying to understand what the results could be of Brexit and also of Trump. And I don't see that this will make any better for the people who have voted for these 2 persons or for Brexit. So my question is, when you see the end result of the negotiations going on with the European Union, will people then say, well, this is not what we wanted, we need another referendum, and then you will stay in the EU? That's my one question. The other one is, I read in today's Financial Times, Martin Wolf provides a devastating attack on Prime Minister Theresa May. And he says that the only way to keep this party together, her party, the Tories, is because of the fear of Corbyn. What will happen? And thirdly, just my comment is, we need more people in politics, people who take on the role in party politics. And I understand your party has never had so many members as you have today.
Well, those were a number of questions. I'll come back to the audience in a minute. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry. The question about the democratic crisis, we don't have quite the same money problem in the UK. We've got pretty strong restrictions. I was talking to a friend of mine from the US, and he said, how much did you spend on your election campaign in 2017, my own personal election? And I said £10,000. And he said, oh, that's quite low by American standards. I think he thought I had missed off 3 noughts. So we, but we do have a democratic crisis of a different form, which Mats was drawing attention to, which is the fact that people just don't believe in voting. And people think the system is rigged and, there's no point. So I don't want to be complacent about the democratic crisis. We do have a democratic crisis. It's just of a different form. How do you restore faith in politics? It's hard. In America, it certainly is about taking the money out of it. I think in Britain, it's about showing that you can answer some of the concerns that people have about their own lives, and that's the most obvious way that you can do it. On the 3 questions, and I'll try and deal with them briefly to give other people a chance to come in. Could we end up with a second referendum? I mean, personally, at the moment, I doubt it, because I think there isn't much movement among people on either side. A little bit of movement, but very little. They haven't seen the results, but the question is, when will they see the results, and who will they blame for the results? My fear is that they won't blame Brexit as a thing. They'll say it was the way it was done, or it was Europe, or whatever. And, you might say, as some of the students said to me, well, surely political leaders should be telling people it's going to be a disaster. The problem with that is that, people think that Remain people, or people who are for Remain, saying it's going to be a disaster. Well, that's what they were saying in the referendum to try and win the referendum. The point I made earlier about people have attached themselves to these labels, and it's very hard now in the short term for people to change their minds about where they are. That's at least the experience so far. Martin Wolf, I read his piece, are the Tories holding together for fear of Corbyn? Yes, is the answer. In fact, they sort of say that. But, holding together is a kind of loose term for what's actually happening, because there is a lot of very big divides in the government, and there are more sensible people in the government. Fundamentally, Theresa May is a hostage to the right wing of her party. And she fears them getting rid of her if she goes against their hard Brexit. and so she can't really be open and honest about what she wants. I think she probably wants a more sensible outcome, but she's quite imprisoned. And that's where Parliament has a very big and important role in avoiding a disastrous outcome. I'm not saying the outcome is going to be good, but it could be disastrous or less bad. And we've got to make sure that disaster, no deal, or a terrible deal doesn't happen. And Parliament, I do think, has a role. And the fact that she hasn't got a majority makes that easier for Parliament to exercise that role. Lastly, Corbyn is to be praised significantly for having got 560,000 members of the party now. And the point is to use those members for engagement, because that's really important.
Thanks, Ed. Panel, if you want to rejoin some of the discussions, you're very welcome. Yes, please.
Yeah, just a short comment on the this third ring. I mean, and on Brexit, I think it's important to see that it's not only the UK that is. Perhaps we'll have to make a second choice, but the EU is moving along as we're having these Brexit discussions. So it won't be the same EU anyway after a couple of years. And I'm afraid that there might be not a huge appetite for some of the countries within the EU for the UK to change their mind, because actually we have countries that believe strongly in the kind of cooperation we are seeing right now. We have strengthened defense cooperation. We're definitely going to need to see strengthening within the Eurozone. And many countries are in favor of this development. So the EU is moving as well. So it won't be that simple just to get back in again if you change your mind. So I strongly believe in what you said about there might be a third circle. I mean, we in Sweden are definitely in the periphery, and there will be a third circle. The irony, of course, is that in a couple of years you might end up in the same circle as Turkey. And that was one of the arguments to get out of the EU, because you fear that Turkey might get in one day. But
Yes, Noura?
Can I just quickly answer your question? I do definitely think that there is a democratic crisis as well. If you look at the Brexit discussions, it was quite clear that no one had any idea what the EU did or does. And this is the case in many European countries. Navigating the political landscape is becoming increasingly difficult for citizens, which also puts more pressure on governments to increase civic education, to actually educate their citizens about, competences at different levels. So when they try to hold government or governance at any level accountable, they hold the right level accountable. And I think in this case, it wasn't the right level.
Thank you. So we have one mic up there, and then we'll come down here.
I have a brief question for Mr. Miliband, which is, do you think that it was right of Jeremy Corbyn, both politically and maybe morally as well, to insist that the Labour Party honour the decision made in the vote, perhaps against the prevailing views of his electorate? And for the Swedish members of the panel, we were looking through this paper by Mr. Fägersten beforehand, and a reflection made here was that the liberal world order, which is mentioned as something binding the Western world together, is perhaps resentment against the economic branch of this world order, which has fueled many things like Brexit, which is an idea that Mr. Miliband went on to expand on. Sweden has rapidly far less equal economically in the last 10, 15 years. Even though it's still one of the most equal countries in Europe, the Gini coefficients for Sweden have risen faster in percentage terms than almost any European country. And simultaneously, then we see the rise of the Swedish Democrats, perhaps other reflections in society. Do you think there are any parallels to be drawn there?
Hi there. I used to live in Lambeth, which obviously was the opposite Doncaster, so we voted to stay, to remain. My question is really about the Labour Party.
Were you there during the referendum?
No,
Oh, right.
I actually happily moved just before, so that felt quite good. However, I've been astounded by the sort of collective psychosis of UK politics as of late. not the least with sort of the Tories having some sort of cannibalism within the party and within obviously the cabinet, but also how they sort of seem to be wanting to go back to 1950s. And then the Labour Party sort of wanted to go back to the 70s. And my question really is, does anyone want to go into the 21st century? Who's representing, you know, a new world order? And I'm quite worried about my old sort of Labour friends in Lambeth, how they are being outmaneuvered by momentum. And it's great that, you know, you've got a surge in membership, but these are also young people who don't necessarily, not interested in actually getting into power, which was the whole idea about New Labour. You know, let's get into power, let's make change. So how do you deal with that in the Labour Party?
What was your name, sorry?
Sorry?
What was your name?
Marielle.
Marielle, thanks.
And then another, just a quick one on Europe, Catalonia. Could that be the second nail in the coffin for sort of the European integration, given that we now see another nation state kind of flouting, we're not abiding to the Convention of Human Rights? Do you feel that it's a good thing that you're out, given that?
Thanks a lot. Björn, that might be one for you as well. Over here.
Thank you. I'm an American, but since the mid-1990s, I lived in Finsbury Park, so I was able to observe British politics for a very long time.
In where, sorry?
Finsbury Park.
Oh, right.
And so I've been able to observe politics sort of close up. I'm happy that it was brought up by two of the speakers, the failure of the political class in the UK and the prolonged failure of the political class for several decades to generate any kind of substantive, positive narrative about Europe. You always had the choice of Europe was bad and we should get out. Europe was bad, but for other reasons, for some reasons, we should stay in. My question, and this is something that hasn't been raised, is to what extent do you think, okay, immigration, we can talk about, obviously that was quite significant, but to what extent do you think the sentiments, for example, of your constituents and around the country relate to a deeper identity crisis and malaise in the UK? One that was summarized, I forget by who, the idea of losing an empire, but not yet finding mission.
Yeah.
And it always struck me as I tried to understand why, for all those years, there was no positive narrative about Europe, why this was absent from any of the parties. I thought about that in terms of the political salience and the problems of trying to advocate a positive narrative about Europe that is anchored in this issue, this malaise that I was talking about. And I have to say very pressingly, this came into very sharp focus with the referendum. And I think for many years I didn't understand or didn't accept perhaps that there was this trouble and this tension in the popular mind in that sense. But I think that actually there is. And this, I don't know what to do about that. I agree, perhaps leaving the EU is the way to do it. What is the term they use? Lance the boil? I think that was how it's been used. You actually take this drastic decision. You get out, you're by yourself, and perhaps then the country can be confronted and begin to sort out this particular problem. Or maybe you have a different view.
Well, Ed.
Okay, good, interesting questions. Look, on Jeremy Corbyn's decision, I agreed with that decision because I think it's very hard to have a referendum. Just to sort of put my cards on the table, I wouldn't have had the referendum if I'd won the election in 2015. I said I wouldn't have had the referendum. I'm glad I didn't sign up to the referendum. But once Cameron won the election and we had the referendum and then it went the way it did, I think it's very, very hard as a Democrat to say, well, we're just going to ignore the result. I mean, other countries in Europe have done it, but, I don't really think he had much choice. I know it wasn't directed at me, but I thought your point about, the Gini coefficient and inequality was bang on because I think that's really important underlying some of these other issues. On Marielle's question about Lambeth and collective psychosis, I don't fundamentally agree with you, I don't think. I don't agree with you that the young people don't want power. I sort of think that is a bit unfair to them because I think they do want power. I just think they have a different view about how you get power. And look, even Tony Blair has been forced to admit after the election, look, he said, I used to, and to be fair to him, he's been pretty honest about this. He said, look, I used to think there was only one way to win, which was to win from what I considered the centre ground. But I now think there are other ways to win. Now, it's not the way I would want. But, just to sort of point up to the Swedish society for a minute, a lot of what was in Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto would be taken as a consensus in Swedish society. Public ownership of some key industries, the fact that do you pay for your tuition here? No, the fact that tuition is free, it wouldn't be seen as dangerously radical in Sweden. It would be seen as boringly mainstream. So in a way, the fact that the young people are demanding that, I don't think is sort of unreasonable. And I know what you mean about the 1970s, but fundamentally, I don't think that's sort of where he is at. And it's true there are lots of people in the Labour Party who think there is only one way to do it, and that's their way. I think actually on both sides, actually, is a bit too much, it's our way or the highway. And I think, both sides need to... I'm somebody who can sort of, in a way, try, is for a kind of more unified party. I'll let other people answer on Catalonia. I mean, I will say that I think some of the response of the government, irrespective of the merits of the issue, has been awful, of the Spanish government. I think it was Dean Acheson who said, lost an empire but not yet found a role. No, it's a good phrase. I think there is definitely an element of that. Struggling to come to terms with what is the role of Britain as a medium-sized country in a new global order. But I also think, and this relates to the first question in this group, I think you're much more likely to be outward-looking and confident internationally if you have social cohesion at home. I think these two things are inextricably linked. The more uncertain and unequal and excluded people feel, the more likely they are to want to close the borders and shut down. And that's, I think, that's the most important kind of link. We'll be more confident and outward looking as a country if we have some more social cohesion.
Thanks, Ed. Anyone like to join in? Please,
did you
Noura?
have any?
See. Okay, I want to relate to the theme about the youth not wanting to be in power. I would say, yes, sure, youths today are probably less active in party politics, but youths, especially here in the EU, like 1 in 2, then when I say youths, I mean those people aged from 15 to 29, 1 in 2 are active in an organization and 1 in 4 are volunteers. So youths today are active in another sort of way. And I would say we need to tap into that activism and tap into that engagement in the civil society and kind of adapt the world to it. Because the world looks different today. Yes, we're not as active in party politics, but we have to use these channels as well. The NGOs, student organizations, and everyone that's related to it. And I'll end there.
Noura?
Yeah, just building on what you were talking about, I'm generalizing here, but I don't think you would find any young person today that don't have political opinions. But as you very eloquently explained, there are other ways to have power. And if we just look at the Swedish system, if you look at the total party membership, it's 251,000. That's very low. That's for all the parties. And then if you look at youth civil society, it's 700,000, almost 3 times as many. And those organizations do work with political issues. But I think it's a failure of politics to not get young people's engagement. And I was speaking at an event with International IDEA the other day, and I see some people there where I said that it's not appealing enough, and it's not accessible enough. And I think those are the 2 main reasons. Young people should not only be part of changing government through elections, but also be part of changing governance, meaning the systems in how we hold elections and the party politics systems. And I also really like your point about, how do we get into the 21st century? You had a point in your introductory statement where you said that status quo is a bad place to be in today's place. But I do think that we have the status quo of 1970s and of way earlier, less cooperation, let's, look inwards. So I do think that we need a new narrative, a new status quo for the 21st century. And the change would be that status quo. And I also do think we need to separate between change and improvement, because we do see a lot of change nowadays. Leaving the EU is a big change, but it's a very simple answer. And building a wall towards Mexico is a very big change, but it's a very simple answer. So change and improvement are two different things. And just building on your point very quickly on inequalities, I think no country can actually succeed if they don't tackle internal inequality in a country and inequality in the rest of the world. Because we see a huge influx of migrants to Europe, and one of the big reasons is, that we see increased inequalities between countries. So, more focus on economic inequalities within countries, while at the same time addressing inequalities between countries. And I think that's it.
Thank you.
I got a question here about the liberal world order, and I think you're right in the sense that the West was so occupied with the thought that this order would be challenged from externally or from non-Western countries, like the BRICS, for example. We've been worrying for years about the BRICS and what they were up to. But the real threat was from within, with the kind of resistance to liberal values and principles and the institutions. We've seen it in the US, to some extent in the UK, and we see it in other European countries, looking at Hungary, Poland, etc., resistant towards the values that underpins this system. But when it comes to the link to populism, I'm not so sure that. We've heard several speakers and Ed as well talking about inequality, and I hate to be the centrist dad here, but I think there's other reasons to populism. It's so complex, and I think economic inequality is really only one part. I think the only common factor of populism today is kind of a sense of status, that you do not have a place in society that you believe that is your right. But it could just as well be cultural or educational, or you could be a man threatened by all the women taking up positions in society, etc., etc. So there's so many causes to why you don't feel that you have the status that you are entitled to. But I think that's the cause, the common cause for populism, and inequality is only one part of that.
Thanks a lot, Björn. Well, back to the audience. Yes, sir. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. So my name is Tor, and I'm a person. So regarding this whole talking about the status quo and how you were saying that one shouldn't embrace the status quo and rather embrace big answers and change in general. My personal experience of British people is that they're way more skeptical of change than people would be, and I was thinking, especially in regards to the referendum we had, I think it was 2011, on having a different election system. I think what you've been saying sort of clashes with that a lot, and that people did not want to have a new election system, a transferable vote, and there was a new sort of big answer that was completely turned down by the population, and mostly from people I spoke with in the UK during that time, with just we got it good already, what's wrong with the status quo, essentially. So yeah, I was wondering how you think about that.
Thank you. Pass the mic to the second row, please.
With regards to populism, this seems clear, as Björn mentioned, which I agree with, that there's both an economic aspect and a cultural aspect to its appeal. Which do you think is sort of the more important and crucial factor here, and why?
Thank you. There was a gentleman up here.
My name is Gary Klauka. I work at International IDEA. Ed, you articulated very well the economic basis for the economic change that's happened in the Western world since the 1980s, or perhaps from earlier. What some people are calling the fourth industrial revolution, where AI and automation will play a very big role, is about to happen. And the sorts of economic consequences that will have on the labor market are something we may not have seen before. They'll be at a pace and a scale which are quite unprecedented. What I've seen is political leaders sort of being able to articulate parts of what this means, but I haven't seen cohesive vision for it. Do you see that? Do you see sort of political leaders being able to argue this? How important do you feel that this is in terms of winning elections or sort of being able to have a political ideology?
It's good questions. Let me start with that. I think that you're right about this point. I think that there's a sort of people fall into two camps in my experience: denial or euphoria, and I think neither is kind of appropriate. Sort of denial that it's ever going to happen, or a sort of Luddite sense that you should sort of resist this tide, or euphoria about how everyone's going to be connected and it's all going to be brilliant. And actually, I think that governments and politics and progressive politics too is somewhat asleep at the wheel on this, because we in earlier eras, I kind of made a hint of this in my remarks, when monopolies arose, like AT&T is a famous monopoly in the United States. Action was taken to prevent that monopoly power leading to domination. So they were forced to give away their patents and so on and so on and so forth. And in a way, it's rather odd that in relation to the tech sector, we've sort of too many people have, as the Americans would say, drunk the Kool-Aid, and because it's sort of whizzy and we can connect on our phones and all of that, it's people are sort of thinking, well, it's okay, we don't need to kind of regulate them really. And I think it's really a serious thing. Actually, to be fair to the European Commission, the commissioner on this has actually been doing a lot to try and do something about it. But I think you're right. I think getting to grips with what it means for jobs and employment. Well, I mentioned the universal basic income, which is one answer. What it means for domination and dominance by certain companies. These are very, very the network effects, as you will know better than me, mean there's a natural tendency to domination by these companies. What does that mean for government? What you do about the rights for working people in the context of these companies, all of those things I think are incredibly important. And I don't think politics has got to grips with it, basically. On the question about what's more important, economics or culture, I think it's a good question, but I think it's sort of a false choice because the two are so related to each other, as I sort of hinted at earlier. I don't think there will be the concerns about immigration if economic circumstances were significantly better. And what's my illustration of that? Because the big divide in Britain at the referendum was not just high income, low income, where higher income people were more likely to vote for Remain, but also graduate, non-graduate. The strong, and Trump too, the strong sense is that if you feel this sort of opening up of the world and sort of, different cultures interacting with each other and people living in different countries, if you feel it's going to benefit you economically because you've got good confidence about your prospects, then you embrace it. Whereas if you feel economically hard done by and you don't have access to these opportunities, you don't embrace it. So I think economics is kind of the underlying factor in all this, but the two are obviously related. But you put it this way, if the economic problems didn't exist, I think the cultural pressures would be significantly less. But if the cultural change didn't exist and the economic problems did exist, I think you'd still have a problem. So it sort of makes me think that economics is the thing underlying it. And then on the question about this is the referendum we had on the alternative vote. Well, look, this is the Mats thesis, if I can put it that way, that, the British people are sort of pragmatic, cautious, and don't really like change. But I mean, we have one very large sort of counterexample to this, which is the Brexit referendum, where people were willing to take a risk. I think on the alternative vote referendum, I think people didn't really see the point of it. I didn't think they think it was about to bring about any change. So I think that's why people didn't go for it. Yes, I think there's a large element of the British people that are resistant to change and cautious about change, but clearly not enough of them. And that's not meant to be facetious. It's just the sort of result of the referendum. I think people did think there was going to be change. And I think the Brexit vote was a change vote. And we can argue about the exact form of change people wanted, but I think the very fact that a very cautious, pragmatic people would vote for something like Brexit tells you something about the scale of the problems that people saw in the society.
Let that sink in. Panel wants to join? Yes, Noura?
I'm fine.
No? Go ahead, Noura.
Just a comment on the fourth industrial revolution. I think you phrased it denial or euphoria. And I think it should be none of them, because we are already in this adaptation period. So it shouldn't be a revolution, it should be an evolution. How do we adapt, new technologies today? How do we bear in mind the perspectives of new technologies that will emerge, of automation that exists and automation that will emerge to today's labor market, instead of pushing it on the future? And I think in many elections this year and last year, we saw this topic completely ignored, where the labor market issues were instead, immigrants are stealing our jobs, people that are not from our country are coming here. But the real discussion we need to have is about a fourth industrial evolution. So it's a really good point. And I think the question about populism, I don't think it's just economics and just a cultural aspect. I think we live in a very rapidly expanding age where we're surrounded by a lot of information. We see a lot of change, some of it that we like, some of it that we don't. And we have been reactive in creating visions for our societies. We don't have a narrative for our societies. In French, I think you call it projet de société, like a vision for society. And basically no party has a vision for society today. They're very reactive. So when populist parties come in with very simple solutions, it's very easy to grab the electorate.
Okay, thank you. Let's do one last round and then we are coming to a close. One here and one here.
Thank you. So one of the things that have been mentioned quite a lot is inequality and profound social changes. You mentioning loss of mining jobs in your constituency. Coming on to that and reflecting on the Brexit results, some of these dynamics were obviously prevalent throughout the UK. For instance, you can say the end of shipbuilding in Glasgow and different industries across Britain and Northern Ireland. But of course, the result was different in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So with that in mind, it seemed that the statement of these issues being prevalent, that it almost seems like you were hinting at that it was almost predetermined because nothing had been done. But of course, the results were different in these countries. So what's your reflection on that it was also a difference between the different countries of the United Kingdom and the result?
Sorry. I actually have a very similar question. You mentioned the North-South divide in the UK, and I was wondering, because it clearly affected the results of Brexit, but I was wondering how you think Brexit will affect that divide and also the divide between the different countries in the UK. So Scotland, which was moving towards an independence referendum again, and Wales and England and Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there a third? Let's over here.
Hello. Okay, I'm Søren Berg. My question, I'm a bit struck about the fact that we're discussing the Brexit very long time without discussing the shortcomings of the European Union itself. My experience is that I met a lot of people that are working with EU projects, formally benefiting from EU funding, but being very resistant to EU. They seek this is a bureaucratic system, and they have a lot of objections to the system. I personally have the same reflection. I'm generally very much in favor of European cooperation, but when I meet people from the Commission and when I see projects, I get often very skeptical. And I think also we have to address the issue of the shortcomings of the Union itself. And I would like to have your opinion on that, not only discussing psychological reasons, but what are the shortcomings for the Union and how can we deal with that?
Thanks a lot. Björn, may I start by your side on the panel, because that's the kind of question I know you care about, and then we'll go through the panel and we'll end up with Ed.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good, very valid question. I mean, the problem is that, I mean, every member state sees very different problems and shortcomings with the EU, and I think the meeting we're had in Gothenburg today is an illustration of that. Some member states see this as the solutions, others see it as actually making the problem even bigger. And I think that goes down to an individual level as well. So it's not that easy to just address. And I would say that the EU has been in kind of a crisis management mood for quite some time, fixing what is perceived to be problems by some member states. So it's difficult to say that, well, now we need to address these shortcomings, because it's actually very different visions of what the EU should be. And I mean, I hear this very often, as you say, that, well, I'm in favor of European cooperation, but skeptical to the EU. The risk is that even if we would do away with the EU, we would end up with something that looks a little bit like the EU, which is an illustration of Brexit. I mean, they're fighting hard to get away, and in the very end, I'm pretty sure that they will come up with something that is essentially mirrors what Cameron once got in his reform suggestion, but without voting rights.
Björn. Natalia?
Yes, I want to continue a bit on the shortcomings of the EU. Yes, of course, no system is perfect, and the EU has a lot of shortcomings, but the cooperation of the EU can also counter-effect all of the challenges that we face with populism and unemployment and all of these structural challenges that Europe faces together. Then the EU can be the force that can ultimately solve them. But to do it, all of the member states have to take an active part of it as well. The member states need to, well, not only the active part, but also to be inclusive and want to be part of the European, society and and share the European values. And also, why people may be also skeptical of the EU can be a result of the EU not being good enough of showing what they actually do, because not many people know how EU actually works, and that's a big issue. Also, in the end, the democratic issue, because people, when they go to when people go and vote for the European Parliament, they don't really know what they're voting for. And many people actually don't go and vote. So I think that showing that people should not be left behind and counteracting the populistic forces is one of the big things that EU can solve in the future.
Thank you, Natalia.
I think one of the major issues is the democratic deficit. And I think especially at the national level, there is a responsibility for parties in national campaigns to also trigger the EU discussion, because it's through the council and not just the parliament that decisions are made. But it's only through the parliament, the European Parliament, that citizens in Europe can vote on EU matters. So I think we really need to anchor European politics better in national politics, If you just look at the fact that 2/3 of decisions that are taken at the municipal level in Sweden are based on directives and proposals from the EU, at the same time, those politicians have, in many cases, no idea how those decisions were taken. So I think it's a matter of accountability between institutions, and it's also an issue of accountability between the EU and citizens. So I think citizens' engagement is one of the major issues. It needs to be increased, but I think we should also highlight that trust in the EU is higher than in most national governments in the EU. But this is very rarely compared. So you just see the numbers of trust in the EU and think that's very negative, but we don't compare it to the trust of national governments.
You, Noura. Ed.
The important questions. Just in reverse order. I actually rather agreed with what you said about the EU. That there are, like any bureaucratic institution, there are lots of problems. I think, though, maybe we've underemphasized in this debate, and it speaks to your question, the slogan of the Leave campaign, "Take back control." I mean, part of that was power is too far away, and it needs to come back to nearer us. And people's sense about it was vague, but it was real. And the sense that the EU was a relatively out-of-touch elite institution a long way away is definitely a problem. And some of it is unfair, and some of it is probably fair, and it would be true of any institution, so I think it's well taken. Who asked the question about the North-South divide? I mean, that is a big problem, because the danger is that you end up with a Brexit settlement that is worse for the North than for the South, and that the North is less able to cope. So the point about, is it going to solve the problems? I mean, Brexit on its own isn't going to solve the problems. It's going to make them harder to solve. The question is whether you can do other things which will actually get at some of these issues that people are facing. But I mean, I think you're completely right to point out the challenge. I wanted to end on this point about Scotland, because this gentleman, I think I'm right in saying, studied in Scotland, in Glasgow. I mean, that referendum was amazing. I went to bed one night, I think on the Sunday, 10 days before the referendum, and this poll had just come out saying Scotland was going to leave. It turned out to be wrong, the poll, I'm glad to say. But, in a way, you can say people voted to stay, yes, 55, but 45 voted to leave. I mean, 45 voted to break up a 300-year-old union and make Scotland an independent country. I mean, in a way, I think Scotland was a bit of a warning about it. About the EU referendum. The SNP are different from UKIP and the people who proposed the European referendum, but I saw in that referendum, the Scottish referendum, exactly the same forces that I've talked about in relation to Brexit. People saying, well, I think things are terrible. Things. I remember walking through a shopping centre in a place called Paisley with a colleague of mine and meeting a woman pushing a pram, and I said, we're from the staying in the No campaign, and she said, no, I'm voting yes, and I said, why? And she said, because you're buying Trident missile system, and I can't get a house. Now, okay, I mean, that's pretty direct, and it was, she wasn't sort of saying, but it wasn't specifically about the issue of independence, but it was about a sense of frustration with the system and the way the system was working. So it's true that the people voted to stay, and it's actually not clear that the SNP will have a second referendum now because the support has faded away. But I think the very fact that we came so close to it, and maybe what is happening in Catalonia as well, is a symptom of some of these forces that we see.
Thanks, Ed. Thank you to the panel. Ed, you've come a long way to come to Stockholm and talk to us. We really appreciate it, and personally I do. You've taught us not to be centrist dads. You've said that we should make change meaningful, perhaps even reconquer the word radicalism. And in every way, you embody something that I really love in Britain and respect, and to a degree envy, and that's the status of, or stature of Parliament itself. The integrity of MPs was famously celebrated by, or stated by Edmund Burke in Bristol some 250 years ago. And you have that integrity, both representing your constituency and the greater good for us in Europe and the world as well. Nice to have had you here.